Thank you, Mr. President. Interesting discussion. And since a couple of the amendments that were brought forward dealt with things such as an increased sales tax and the Minnesota story, I'm happy to talk about that briefly. 2 years ago, I took a great interest in Minnesota's water legacy. Senator Hart was with me on that 3-day trip to study what's going on in the state of Minnesota. And I came away, I don't know what Senator Hart came home with. It was an interesting tour, right? We learned a lot. I maybe learned some things that you didn't, or I saw them differently. But I had some real doubts. I saw an awful lot of money thrown on the table, and I had a million questions about how that money was being spent. And since the 3/8 cent came up, and since Minnesota came up, I'm going to tell the body, and I'm not going to read this whole article. This is from the Star Tribune, the Minnesota Star Tribune, dated March 20, 2017, so it's pretty recent. And this article confirmed to me those doubts and those concerns that I had when I was there 2 years ago. So I'm going to read some highlights. The headline is, Auditor asks, did $761 million produce cleaner lakes and streams for Minnesota? And the article goes on to try to answer that question. So here, some of the pertinent points. Minnesota has spent $761 million from the state's 2008 legacy amendment. That's the 3/8 of a cent sales tax increase, very similar to ours, to clean up and protect lakes and streams. But it's too soon to know whether the funding has made any difference. Later on, the article said this: last year, presumably 2016, legislators directed the auditor's office to answer questions that have frustrated them since the legacy amendment was passed by voters in 2008. Can the state measure the outcomes for water quality? What good has the money done? And is the distribution of the money transparent? The biggest question, whether the money is improving water quality across Minnesota, cannot yet be answered, the auditor's office said. In part, that's because it takes many years to change the land use practices that cause water pollution, and even longer for those changes to show up in water quality. That acknowledges the difficulty of the issue, and I think we would all agree with that. This is a complicated issue with many components, and it takes a long time and a lot of good efforts to move the needle. The article goes on to say this: only now does the state have a strategic plan in place to track such long-term changes, a 10-year cycle of measurements on each of the state's 80 major watersheds. Listen closely. By far, the largest chunk of clean water funds, 36%, has gone to the State Board of Water and Soil Resources. It has spent $276 million primarily to buy conservation easements in agricultural regions of the state to protect groundwater and surface waters from nitrate and phosphorus pollution, and to fix septic systems and control stormwater runoff. Interesting numbers coming up. The report estimates that those funds have reduced nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, the two nutrients, by 256,000 pounds per year. But that's only a tiny fraction of the reductions needed to bring the state's waters back to the point where they are swimmable, fishable, and drinkable, the report says. More interesting numbers. The second largest chunk, $206 million was spent by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency primarily for testing and monitoring that is required to identify polluted waters and to measure change over time. That was the 3/8 of a cent sales tax increase, the Minnesota legacy of 2008. I'm sure the story will be continued. Now I want to read a few things from a presentation that Senator Johnson mentioned when Marty Braster came to testify to our committee representing the Rathbun Land and Water Alliance, a very successful story relative to water quality. That's in my district and Senator Sinclair's district. In 2004, I'll just read the comments. Since the Rathbun Land and Water Alliance's Protect Rathbun Lake project began in 2004, nearly 600 landowners have worked with the project staff to implement conservation practices to protect Rathbun Lake. Rathbun Lake is the water source for Rathbun Regional Water Association, which provides drinking water to 80,000 people in 51 communities and 18 counties in southern Iowa and northern Missouri. The action taken by these landowners has reduced sediment delivery to Rathbun Lake by nearly 50,000 tons per year. Phosphorus delivery to the Rathbun Lake has been reduced by more than 200,000 pounds annually. Close to 2 million feet of terraces and nearly 600 grade stabilization structures and sediment basins have been installed by these landowners. To date, Senator Garrett, to your point, to date, landowners have contributed $4.5 million to the protection of Rathbun Lake by installing best management practices. So I'm reading these two stories to contrast two programs, the Minnesota plan and the Iowa way of doing things. 8 years and $761 million later, Minnesota claims they've reduced the flow of nitrogen and phosphorus in total to the waters by 256,000 pounds. But in one small watershed in southern Iowa, collaborative efforts by farmers, by the Rural Water Association, by a whole bunch of stakeholders, results in annual reduction of 200,000 pounds of phosphorus alone into Rathbun Lake. I'm going to ask you to compare those two. There's a huge contrast here. I think I prefer the Iowa way, and the Iowa way is what's reflected in Senate File 512. Now, just to address a couple of comments that were made. That seems to be a catchphrase in 2017, writing legislation behind closed doors. This bill, ladies and gentlemen, is virtually the same bill that passed the Iowa House a year ago on a 65-33 bipartisan vote. There's no secrets here. The only thing that's changed from that is some tweaks in the funding mechanisms. So I guess I simply challenge the charge, the oft-made charge, that this was drafted behind closed doors. With that, I want to make a few more remarks to close this out. I think Senate File 512 is the next logical step for the nutrient reduction strategy. Our cities and towns, especially our small rural communities, need assistance with their wastewater and drinking water projects. Momentum has been increasing since the introduction of the strategy in 2013. Terms like cover crops and bioreactors and saturated buffers and bioreactors were not well known a few years ago, but now are part of the vernacular in the farm community. This bill provides policy and funding for long-term, collaborative, science-based, non-regulatory projects that I believe will move the needle in reducing the flow of nutrients in Iowa's rivers and streams. The money the state of Iowa allocates to these efforts will be matched with dollars from local governments, from federal programs, from industry, and from the agricultural sector. The funding provisions of this bill sunset at the end of fiscal year 29. After 10 years of fully funding this initiative, we will have learned a great deal, and then we can thoughtfully determine the path forward. I ask for strong bipartisan support for this important legislation. Unanimous vote would be great. This is the right thing for this legislature to do for the state, and now is the right time to do it. I ask that Senate File 512 be read for the final time and placed on its passage.